How are chess strategies invented? In some cases, you can point to a brilliant game, or perhaps a few brilliant games that are admired, shared, and taught to future generations. A great example is future world champion Jose Raul Capablanca's use of the queenside pawn majority to defeat many-time US champion Frank Marshall. In what Capablanca considered one of the most accurate games of his career, he simply steamrolls Marshall, illustrating the power of this queenside pawn majority concept in our seventh best chess game of the 1900s. Marshall has the white pieces and opens the game with pawn to d4. Capablanca responds pawn d5, and we get c4, e6, and knight c3, c5. c5 is a pretty sharp and dynamic move, and it may not immediately seem consistent with Capablanca's style, which, as we'll see in this game, can tend to extremely smooth classical play. But Capablanca does give some explanations for that as the game develops. He starts introducing this game by saying, "Before this game was played, Rubinstein and Mises had engaged in a series of games which were shown to me by some of my friends desirous of knowing my opinion with respect to them. I liked Mises' ninth move, knight to e4, and decided to play it against Marshall, who I hoped had not seen the games. Such was the case, and I was able to wind up the match with one of the most accurate games I have ever played." As Capablanca indicates, the game follows beaten paths, at least beaten paths known to him. Pawn takes d5, e takes d5, knight f3, knight c6, g3, very typical in the Tarrasch variation to fianchetto this light squared bishop, which may hope to put pressure on the pawn on d5. Bishop to e6, bishop g2, bishop to e7, castles, knight to f6. Now, in this position, Marshall plays bishop to g5. And this is actually quite theoretical, although Capablanca is critical of it. Capablanca says this is not good, and pawn takes d5 is the correct continuation. The computer does agree, though, that pawn takes c5 is slightly preferable, but this is well-established theory. I want to illustrate this position just for a moment, though, because Marshall does decline to capture on c5 at any point, and as a result, he never creates the isolated d-pawn here that can be a target for his pieces. Bishop g5 is a perfectly good move, but at some point, isolating the d-pawn is really the natural and correct way to play, and today we understand that white should have a slight advantage in the Tarrasch variation as a result. But in the game, we get bishop g5, and now Capablanca goes for knight to e4. So this is kind of the surprise move that he's seen Mises play, and he wants to use it against Marshall. He gets it in. He says it's a very good reply, which frees Black's game. Now, we get bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and here I think there's a bit of a mistake from Marshall. Knight to e5. And Capablanca seems to consider this the best move in the position, even though I really think it costs white any advantage that you might have. Instead, pawn takes c5, again focusing on the isolated pawn, makes sense. Now, this does allow knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and white's structure has been shattered. And Capablanca indicates that this is really good for him. He says he has an excellent game after this, but the modern computer disagrees. Some issues for Black are that Black is still not castled, that this bishop is bad, and that white has some open lines that can be utilized right away. For example, if queen captures on c5, Black has a great structure, but white is immediately getting pressure, like rook b1, threatening this pawn right here, so you need to make some kind of a move like pawn b6 or queen e7, which are not helping your development, and now you have moves like knight g5 here. And there are other ideas. You have pawn breaks that sometimes get played, pawn c4, pawn e4, queen a4, lots of different things that can come to play in different lines, and generally, Black is in a bit of trouble in these lines. So an interesting option to focus on activity at the cost of good structure. Instead, though, after knight e5, white's really losing any advantage because white is moving pieces twice without kind of dealing with tension in the middle of the board. And Capablanca finds the best move, which is knight takes d4 right here. So he picks up this centralized pawn, and now, of course, Marshall's able to get a pawn back. Knight takes e4, pawn takes e4. This pawn is going to fall, although you can't take it right away because if bishop takes e4, there's bishop h3 hitting the rook, and there's a lot of problems on the e-file, so in this position, white would lose. But the pawn will still fall after pawn e3, which is played. And things are simplifying, and you know, if this was So versus Nakamura or two modern grandmasters, we could expect a draw very soon. But in this game, we're going to see opportunities for black to go wrong from here, or for white to go wrong from here. Knight f3 check, and knight takes f3. Instead, Capablanca preferred bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, and then a little inclusion, queen a4 check here. And he intended to play king f8. He thought this was the best way for white to play. Actually, modern computer analysis indicates that black is doing really well here because although the king is moved, and that might seem inconvenient, here you have bishop d5. And these light squares, when you've given up the light squared bishop for white, are a big problem. So one has to disagree with Capablanca's analysis here and say that Marshall should not have played this way, that this way was really good for black, very, very dangerous, and Marshall's continuation is better. Knight takes f3, he keeps the light squared bishop, and it should be a draw with good play. So pawn takes f3, queen takes f3, and here black castles and Capablanca comments. Black has the better game, since white cannot play queen takes b7 because of queen takes b7, bishop takes b7, rook to b8, and after the bishop falls back, rook takes b2. Capablanca notes, black has the better game, since white cannot play queen takes b7 because of queen takes b7, bishop takes b7, rook to b8, followed by rook takes b2, holding all the lines and having a free pawn, I think meaning a pass pawn, to boot, which should win. Marshall doesn't go for the capture on b7 and instead plays rook f to c1 after Capablanca castles. Here we get rook a b8, defending the pawn and of course intending to advance it, queen to e4, and now queen c7, which might seem like an odd move, but Capablanca explains that he is avoiding the exchange of bishops. For example, after b5, bishop h3, taking advantage of the pin here, and he wants to avoid this exchange of bishops because it will weaken the black pawn structure, and he considers his bishop superior to the bishop that's on g2. It looks like a beautiful diagonal, but it's not actually attacking anything. So after queen e4, queen c7, we see rook c3. And this is maybe the most mysterious move in the game for me. And the computer says that this is 0.000, you know, all the zeros. And this isn't a mistake, but I don't understand why you want to lift the rook here. Doubling rooks just doesn't make any sense. You need to be contesting the d file. And although with more accurate play later, you could have still been equal, this introduces a lot of ways to go wrong, and it just doesn't seem to be focused on contesting the d file and equalizing the position. It seems ambitious in a way, and I don't know why you would put the rook on c3. We just see b5 here, supernatural, and now here is the critical position for Marshall. Here he must play pawn to b3 and make sure that black cannot advance on the queen side without liquidating the pawns and, you know, not being able to retain any advantage. After b3, everything should still be equal, though I think any grandmaster would pick black in the position. If pawn to c4 here, trying to push forward and establish the passed pawn, white can capture here, and if you capture back, this pawn is honestly more weak than it is strong. It is a passed pawn, but unlike the previous line where black was very active and it was hard to stop the pawn, here white's able to go for it with bishop f1 and rook c1, and you can play these moves in any order, and you're doing really, really well. This pawn is just too vulnerable. But that wasn't played. Instead, pawn to a3 was played, and now we get pawn c4, an excellent move. This move is restricting the white pawns on the queen side, and it stops rook d3, so black is now going to seize the d file. And a3 has Maybe not lost the game with computer perfect defense here, but close. It's now a huge advantage for black after pawn c4, bishop f3, and rook fd8. And Capablanca here shares a comment actually from the reigning world champion Emmanuel Lasker, who says, Black has now full command of the board. His play is an example of how slight advantages should be utilized. And Capablanca responds, there is no better complement required. After rook fd8, we see rook d1, and we can trade a pair of rooks, and the other rook replaces the previous rook on the d file. Capablanca maintains control of the open file. It's often said in chess that you need two advantages or two weaknesses in the opponent's camp to win the game. Here, the two advantages are the queenside pawn majority and the control of the open d file. The queenside pawn majority in and of itself puts a lot of pressure on white, but probably doesn't win the game. With the open d file as well, now we're talking about winning the game. We get bishop f3, pawn g6, thinking sometimes about bishop f5, and queen c6. And this might be the losing mistake, but it was already a very difficult position. I'm not sure you could save it without this move, but this just helps black exchange and maintain control of the d file and immediately start attacking on the queen side. Instead, you had to do just like a sitting move, like king g2, but it sucks. Like, you don't want to do it, but that's like the best you can do is just keep sitting. After queen c6, we get a great move, queen e5, centralizing the queen, holding onto the b pawn. You don't want to trade the queens because, as Capablanca says, I could not yet exchange the queens on c6 because my knight's pawn would be attacked. After queen e5, with the strong queen in the center of the board, white has to pull back, losing time with queen e4. Now you can trade queens. There's no attack here on the pawn on b5, so you have time for rook d1 check. Capablanca comments, very important. Black must stop the approach of the white king by means of bishop c2, followed by king f1. It's important to have an open file, but if you can't invade on it, it's not actually that useful. Rook d1 check maintains control of the open file and ensures that there are entry points. White's not able to just hold the rook back and prevent invasion. The rook has already invaded. So after rook d1 check, we get king g2, pawn to a5. The pawns are rolling. You can't here go after the b5 pawn. You're too slow. Bishop c6, the pawn pushes forward. b4, trades. Rook c2, you don't have any other squares. b3, you can't go here because you're just losing the b2 pawn. Rook e2, you just go rook c1, and this move is too strong. You can't stop it with the bishop because f5, the bishop is out of squares, so rook c2 comes, and you're just losing. The pawn and the rook and everything cannot be held together. Black wins by force. So after a5, we see rook c2, sitting passively, pawn to b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, bishop f3, rook b1, attacking this pawn right here, the target in the position, bishop e2, pawn b3. And here, interesting note from Capablanca, he points out that you can't play rook c3 here because after rook takes b2, bishop takes c4. It's not an exchange of pawns. Black must find rook c2, the strong move that wins a piece and wins the game because you cannot trade, then this pawn just queens. So backing up, after b3, we see rook d2 from Marshall, and now rook c1, going for that rook c2 idea that we've already seen, bishop d1, and the breakthrough, this bishop is under attack. So pawn c3, pawn takes b2, the pawn is queening unless you take it, but now after rook takes d1, Black is just up a bishop for 2 pawns, and it might seem like it's not so decisive, but it actually really is. The pieces are going to coordinate really well, and there's no chance to advance the pawns and create counterplay. The technique from Capablanca is very instructive from here. One thing I want to point out before we advance is, having just seen the combination here that won the piece and won the game, why was the queenside pawn majority so strong for Capablanca here. He demonstrates his play so well, he explains it so well, but conceptually, what is it about the queenside pawn majority strategy that's really effective as opposed to the kingside pawn majority? In this kind of case, the problem is that these pawns right here can't advance without creating weaknesses in the white king position. So you have an extra pawn on the king side, but pushing it only creates weaknesses. On the queen side, where the kings are not present, you're able to push the pawn up the board and create the possible pass pawn, and in some cases, the actual pass pawn, and those threats are very significant. Pushing the pawns only gains space, gains pass pawn tactics. It doesn't weaken your king position. So that's why in many cases, a queenside pawn majority is just great, super helpful, and a kingside pawn majority isn't able to advance and isn't effective. So from here, technique. Rook c2, bishop to f5, tickling the rook, rook b2, rook c1. The rook is behind the pass pawn, so it's not going to be able to advance. Rook b3, bishop e4 check. The king moves because you don't really want to block and give up control of the second rank. So king h3, rook c2, attacking the f2 pawn. Pawn to f4, and now in this position h5, very, very nice move, and Capablanca notes, threatening bishop f5 check, followed by rook takes h2 check, and king g7, which is basically leading to mate. As white's only defense must lose a pawn, his game becomes hopeless. He could have resigned at this point. The rest requires no further comment. The rest was pawn g4, h takes g4, king takes g4, the h2 pawn does fall, so white now only has one pawn for the piece, and the king is in trouble. Rook b4, f5 check, king to g3, rook to e2, the e3 pawn is in trouble too, rook c4, rook takes e3 check, king h4, trying for counterplay, but it's actually this king that is in trouble. King g7, rook c7 check, king h6, rook d7, and bishop g2, threatening checkmate, basically an unstoppable checkmate. There's one more check, rook d6 check, and then king g7, but the king is headed over here. And then that will renew this threat right here. If white tries king to g5 in this position, going for counterplay, it's just mate in two, rook g3 check, king forced back here, rook g4, checkmate. Throughout a perfect demonstration of piece coordination from Capablanca, I think you can understand why he says it's one of the most accurate games that he's ever played. I think you can understand why this is a model game that people look to explain the queenside pawn majority and to replicate that strategy in winning their own games where they have the same advantage. I hope you've enjoyed this game. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the 1900s and other decades, click on the playlists that are popping up on your screen as I speak.